Okay, welcome back. I'm coming back with a very serious recording this time. I got my hair pulled out of my face because it's a little less annoying. I might look a little ridiculous because of this silly tuft of hair that won't do anything. And this one. But anyway, I am continuing with Human All Too Human. I'm kind of going back in time a little bit. I haven't recorded anything on Human All Too Humans in 4 months. It's been 4 months since the last part. But I am beginning the next section. It is the history of the moral feeling. I'm picking up right where I left off at part 35. Written by Mr. Friedrich Nietzsche, of course. I'm picking up right where I left off, part 35. Advantages of psychological observation. That reflection regarding the human all too human, or as the learned jargon is, psychological observation, is among the means whereby the burden of life can be made lighter. That practice in this art affords presence of mind in difficult situations and entertainments amid a wearisome environment. A. That maxims may be cooled in the thorniest and least pleasing paths of life, and invigoration thereby obtained. This much was believed, was known in former centuries. Why was this forgotten in our own century, during which, at least in Germany, yes, in Europe, poverty, as regards psychological observation, would have been manifest in many ways? Had there been anyone to whom this poverty could have manifested itself, not only in the novel, in the romance, in the philosophical standpoints. These are the works of exceptional men. Still more, in the state of opinion regarding to public events and personages. Above all, in general society, which says much about men, but nothing whatever about man. There is totally lacking the art of psychological analysis and synthesis. But why is the richest and most harmless source of entertainment thus allowed to run to waste? Why is this greatest master of psychological maxim no longer read? For, with no exaggeration whatever, be it said, the educated person in Europe who has read La Rochefoucauld, sorry, La Rochefoucauld, and his intellectual and artistic affinities is very hard to find. Still harder, the person who knows them and does not disparage them. Apparently, too, this unusual reader takes far less pleasure in them than the form adopted by these artists should afford him. For the subtlest mind cannot adequately appreciate the arts of maxim making unless it has had training in it, unless it has competed in it. Without such practical acquaintances, hmm, acquaintance, one is apt to look upon this making and forming as a much easier thing than it really is. One is not keenly enough alive to the felicity and the charm of success. Hence, present day readers of maxims have but a moderate, tempered pleasure in them. Scarcely, indeed, a true perception of their merits, so that their experiences are about the same as those of the average beholder of cameos. People who praise because they cannot appreciate and are very ready to admire and still readier to turn away. 36. Objection. Or is there a counter proposition to the dictum that psychological observation is one of the means of consoling, lightening, charming existence? Have enough of the unpleasant effects of this art been experienced to justify the person striving for culture and turning his regard away from it? In all truth, a certain blind faith in the goodness of human nature, an implanted distaste for any disparagement of human concern, a sort of shamefacedness at the nakedness of the soul, may be far more desirable things in the general happiness of a man. That this only occasionally advantageous quality of psychological sharp-sightedness, and perhaps belief in the good, in virtuous men and action, in a plenitude of disinterested benevolence, has been more productive of good in the world of men in so far as it has made men less distrustful. If Plutarch's heroes are enthusiastically imitated, and a reluctance is experienced to looking too critically into the motives of their actions, not the knowledge, but the welfare of human society is promoted thereby. Psychological error, and above all, obtuseness in regard to it, help human nature forward, whereas knowledge of the truth is more promoted by means of the stimulating strength of a hypothesis, as La Rochefoucauld, in the first edition of his Sentences of Moral Maxims, has expressed it. What the world calls virtue is ordinarily but a phantom created by the passions, and to which we give a good name in order to do whatever we please with impunity. La Rochefoucauld and those other French masters of soul searching, to the number of whom has lately been added a German, the author of psychological observation, are like expert marksmen who again and again hit the black spot. But it is the black spots in human nature. Their art inspires amazement, but finally, some spectator, inspired not by the scientific spirit, but by a humanitarian feeling, execrates an art that seems to implant in the soul a taste for belittling and impeaching mankind. 37. Nevertheless, hold on. Ooh, it's cold. Better. Sorry, I gotta take a second. This is a serious read. It's not bad though. I really like it. But I mean, obviously, it's Friedrich Nietzsche, so I'm taking it with a grain. But You'll be all right. Bet you never heard anybody say that statement halfway before. Anyway, 37. Nevertheless, the matter, therefore, as regards pro and con, stands thus. In the present state of philosophy, an awakening of the moral observation is essential. The repulsive aspect of psychological dissection with the knife and tweezers entailed by the process can no longer be spared humanity. Such is the imperative duty of any science that investigates the origin and history of the so-called moral feeling, and which, in its progress, is called upon to posit and to solve advanced social problems. The older philosophy does not recognize the newer at all, and through paltry evasions has always gone astray in the investigation of the origin and history of human estimates. Worthschatzungen. That's why I want to learn German. Anyway, with what results may now be very clearly perceived, since it has been shown by many examples how the errors of the greatest philosophers have their origin in a false explanation of certain human actions and feelings. How, upon the foundation of an erroneous analysis, for example, of the so-called disinterested actions, a false ethic is reared, to support which religion and like mythological monstrosities are called in, until finally the shades of these troubled spirits collapse in physics and in the comprehensive world point of view. But if it be established that superficiality of psychological observation has heretofore set the most dangerous snares for human judgment and deduction, and will continue to do so, all the greater need is there of that steady countenance or continuance of labor that never wearies, putting stone upon stone, little stone upon little stone. All the greater need is there of a courage that is not ashamed of such humble labor, and that will oppose persistence to all contempt. It is, finally, also true that countless single observations concerning the human all too human have been first made and uttered in circles accustomed not to furnish matter for scientific knowledge, but for intellectual pleasure seeking. And the original home atmosphere, a very seductive atmosphere of the moral maxim, has almost inextricably interpenetrated the entire species, so that the scientific man involuntarily manifests a sort of mistrust of this species and of its seriousness. But it is sufficient to point to the consequences, for already it is becoming evident that events of the most propitious nature are developing in the domain of psychological observation. What is the leading conclusion arrived at by one of the subtlest and calmest of thinkers? the author of the work concerning the origin of moral feelings, as a result of his thorough and incisive analysis of human conduct. The moral man, he says, stands no nearer the knowledge, metaphysical world than the physical man. Hold on, what? The moral man, he says, stands no nearer the knowledgeable. Oh, hold on, what the fuck? I'm gonna have to edit that out. The moral man, he says, stands no nearer the knowledge knowable metaphysical world than the physical man. This dictum, I really hate this. Why? Okay, I'm trying that one more time. I have not made any mistakes. Come on. Knowable. That's a word. The moral man, he says, stands no nearer the knowable metaphysical world than the physical man. This dictum, grown hard and cutting beneath the hammer blow of historical knowledge, can someday, perhaps in some future or other, serve as the axe that will be laid to the root of the metaphysical necessities of man, whether more to the blessing than to the banning of universal well being. Who can say? But in any event, a dictum fraught with the most momentous consequences, fateful, uh, fruitful, and fearful at once, and confronting the world in the two-faced way characteristic of all great facts. 38. To what extent useful? Therefore, whether psychological observation is more an advantage than a disadvantage to mankind may always remain undetermined. But there is no doubt that it is necessary, because science can no longer dispense with it. Science, however, recognizes no considerations of ultimate goals or ends any more than nature does. But as the latter duly matures things of the highest fitness for certain ends without any intention of doing it, so will true science, doing with ideas what nature does with matter, promote the purposes and the welfare of humanity an occasion may afford, and in many ways, and attain fitness to ends, but likewise without having intended it. Basically, as the counterfeit of nature in regard to ideas. He to whom the atmospheric conditions of such a prospect are too wintry has too little fire in him. Let him look about him, and he will become sensible of maladies requiring an icy air, and of people who are so kneaded together out of the ardor of intellect that they cannot scarcely find anywhere an atmosphere too cold and cutting for them. Moreover, as two serious individuals and nations stand in need of trivial relaxation, as others, too, volatile and excitable, require wondrous, weighty ordeals to render them entirely healthy. Should not we, the more intellectual men of this age, which is swept more and more by conflagration, catch up every cooling and extinguishing appliance we can find, that we may always remain as self-contained, steady, and calm as we are now, and thereby, perhaps, serve this age as its mirror and self-reflector when the occasion arises? 39. The fable of discretionary freedom. The history of the feelings, on the basis of which we make everyone responsible. Hence, the so-called moral feeling is traceable in the following leading phases. At first, single actions are termed good or bad, without any reference to their motive, but solely because of the utilitarian or prejudicial consequences they have for the community. In time, however, the origin of these designations is forgotten, but it is imagined that action in itself, without reference to its consequences, contains the property good or bad, with the same error according to which language designates the stone itself as hardness, the tree itself as greenness. For the reason, therefore, that what is consequence is comprehended as a cause. Accordingly, the goodness or badness is incorporated into the motive, and any deed by itself is regarded as morally ambiguous. A step further is taken, and the predication, good or bad, is no longer made of the particular motives, but of the entire nature of a man, out of which motive grows 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 the plants out of the soil. Thus, man is successively made responsible for his particular acts, then for his course of conduct, then for his motives, and finally for his nature. Now, at last, is it discovered that this nature even cannot be responsible, inasmuch as it is only and wholly a necessary consequence, and is synthesized of the elements and influence of past and present things. Therefore, that man is to be made responsible for nothing, neither for his nature, nor his motives, nor his course of conduct, nor his particular acts. By this process is gained the knowledge that the history of moral estimates is the history of error, of the error of responsibility, as is whatever rests upon the error of the freedom of the will. Skolfener concluded just the other way. Thus, since certain actions bring depression, consciousness of guilt in their train, there must then exist responsibility, for there would be no basis for this depression at hand if all man's affairs did not follow their course of necessity, as they do, indeed, according to the opinion of this philosopher, follow their course. But man himself, subject to the same necessity, would be just the man that he is, which Skolfener denies. From the fact of such depression, Skolfener believes himself able to prove a freedom which man in some way must have had, not indeed in regard to his actions, but in regard to his nature. Freedom, therefore, to be thus, and so not to act thus. And so, out of the essay, the sphere of freedom and responsibility follows according to his opinion. The operari, the spheres of invariable pulsation, necessity, and irresponsibility. This depression, indeed, is due apparently to the operari in so far as it be delusive. But, in truth, to whatever essay be the deed of a free will, the basic cause of the existence of an individual, in order to let man become whatever he wills to become, his to will, or wollen, must precede his existence. Here, apart from the absurdity of the statement just made, there is drawn the wrong inference that the fact of the depression explains its character. The rational admissibility of it. From such a wrong inference does Skolfener first come to his fantastic consequence of the so-called discretionary freedom. Intelligible Freiheit. For the origin of this fabulous entity, Plato and Kant are equally responsible. But depression after the act does not need to be rational. Indeed, it is certainly not so at all, for it rests upon the erroneous assumption that the act need not necessarily have come to pass. Therefore, only because man deems himself free, but not because he is free, does he experience remorse and the stings of conscience. Moreover, this depression is something that can be grown out of. In many men, it is not present at all as a consequence of acts which inspire it in many other men. It is a very varying thing, and one closely connected with the developments of custom and civilization, and perhaps manifest only during a relatively brief period of the world's history. No one is responsible for his acts, no one for his nature. To judge is tantamount to being unjust. This applies as well when the individual judges himself. The proposition is as clear as sunlight. And yet, here, everyone prefers to go back to darkness and untruth for fear of the consequences. Hmm, okay. 40. Above animal. The beast in us must be wheedled. Ethic is necessary, that we may not be torn to pieces without the errors involved in the assumptions of ethics. Man would have remained an animal. Thus, he has taken himself as something higher and imposed rigid laws upon himself. He feels hatred, consequently, for states approximating the animal, whence the former contempt for the slave as a not yet man, as a thing, is to be explained. 41. Unalterable character. That character is unalterable is not in the strict sense true. Rather, is this favorite proposition valid only to the extent that during the brief life period of a man, the potent new motives cannot, usually, press down hard enough to obliterate the lines imprinted by ages. Could we conceive of a man 80,000 years old? We should have in him an absolutely alterable character, so that the maturities of successive varying individuals would develop in him. The shortness of human life leads to many erroneous assertions concerning the qualities of man. 42. Classification of enjoyments and ethic. The once uh, accepted comparative classification of enjoyments, according which an inferior, higher, highest egoism may crave one or another enjoyment, now decides as to ethical status or unethical status, a lower enjoyment. For example, sensual pleasure preferred to a more highly esteemed one. For example, health rates as unethical as does welfare preferred to freedom. The comparative classification of enjoyment is not, however, alike, or the same at all periods. When anyone demands satisfaction of the law, he is, from the point of view of an earlier civilization, moral. From that of the present, non moral. Unethical indicates, therefore, that a man is not sufficiently sensible to the higher, finer impulses which the present civilization has brought with it, or is not sensible to them at all. It indicates backwardness, but only from the point of view of the contemporary degree of distinction. The comparative classification of enjoyments itself is not determined according to absolute ethics, but after each new ethical adjustment, it is then decided whether conduct be ethical or the reverse. All right. Thank you all so very much for watching DJ's Chronicles, and I hope you enjoyed that. But please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for being here.